Good evening. Can you hear me? Don?
You have to.
I'm Tony Marks. I'm the president of the New York Public Library, and it is my delight, an honor to welcome you all here for an important conversation. Welcome to the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Library for tonight's 7 Stories Up talk, The Future of Affirmative Action. We're honored to have an amazing array of speakers tonight. Richard Kahlenberg is the director of the American Identity Project at the Progressive Policy Institute and the author of Class Matters. Jason Riley is senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a columnist for the Wall Street Journal and author of The Affirmative Action Myth. Justin Driver is the Robert R. Slaughter Professor of Law at Yale Law School and the author of The Fall of Affirmative Action, Race, the Supreme Court, and the Future of Higher Education. And lastly, distinguished journalist, former dean of the Columbia Journalism School, Nicholas Lemann, who is also the author of The Big Test, an important book on what looked like meritocracy through the SAT, but was not quite that. As a former president of Amherst College, I worked with and learned from Rick Kahlenberg on promoting socioeconomic diversity at a time when no other institutions were pursuing that important issue, as well as racial diversity among our student body. Let me just be clear, both are critically important in creating rich and intellectually stimulating environments for learning and student growth. We must have a diverse student body in order to have the kind of education and conversations that the students and we all can learn from. We have seen many of the changes that we were working towards then challenged or even rolled back in recent years, including through the Supreme Court of the United States, with what I would describe as tragic results in terms of the current numbers of enrollment. It is crucial, remains crucial, that our colleges and universities, our great colleges and universities, an essential leadership resource for this country and for the world that are in such difficult times, that those colleges and universities find a legally viable way to create racially and socioeconomically diverse student bodies going forward. In order to do this, in order to withstand the challenges that we have seen, we have to think differently. Rick and our other speakers have been urging us for decades to think strategically, differently, and more effectively. We have not heard the call in the way that we needed to. The evidence is clear. And so we continue the conversation tonight so that we can all find that path forward. Before we begin, I want to thank the Stavros Niarchos Foundation for making programs like this possible, and to also remind you that if you don't already have a library card, you can get one at any information desk in this building, and if you haven't explored this building, the crown jewel of our branch library system, I urge you to do so. Finally, I would like to encourage you to visit NYPL's website and take a look at the upcoming 7 Stories Up programs like this one. We have excellent lineup this season featuring new fiction, nonfiction, music, local history, and more. It's essential that we all come together, that we learn together, and that we maintain our community together in these hard times. And now please join me in welcoming our panelists and Nick Lemann, who will be our MC for tonight. Nick?
Thanks for coming. We're going to try to do this in a sort of fast-paced way because we're extraordinarily lucky to have 3 distinguished authors, all of whom have new books out about affirmative action at just the moment when, you know, the phrase 1-2 punch. So punch number 1 was the SFFA decision, and punch number 2 is a whole bunch of stuff that's going on between Washington and elite universities right now. So this is a topic that's really in the news. So just to stipulate, again, I'm going to try to keep things moving at a very brisk pace here. And I encourage you to interrupt each other. And then after X amount of time, we'll go to audience Q&A. So I want to stipulate, we're talking about a sort of small but very highly charged zone of American society. There's something like 3,500 degree granting institutions in the United States. Maybe 50 are highly selective. They're the ones that, I don't know most of you in the room, but I'm guessing they're the ones that are top of mind for a lot of people in this audience, and maybe even for us on the panel. Admission to them is a zero-sum game, and the most selective ones admit an incredibly small number of students, which is a testament to the fact that many more people want to go there than can go there. So let me just start with a very basic question, okay? And I'm going to get back to affirmative action, but given what I just said, that there's a quite small number of elite universities that have way more people who want to go there than they have seats, what should be the basic principle they use for deciding, you know, what 5% or whatever it is of all those applicants to give seats to? Rick?
Yeah, first of all, let me just thank Tony for hosting this forum. For those of you who don't know, Tony was a tremendous leader at Amherst in really getting the country to care about socioeconomic diversity as well as racial diversity. So honored that you are here. I would say essentially we want a system that's fair. And by that I mean one that taps into the most talented students who can contribute the most to society over the long haul. So I do care about the environment that's on campus. I don't want to have people of different backgrounds for that reason. But I think that is a secondary consideration. I think most Americans realize that an opportunity to go to an elite college is a ticket to the American dream. Our leadership class disproportionately comes from a tiny number of colleges. And so it matters who gets in, and so the process should try to assess an individual's potential to contribute with an eye to the obstacles that they have overcome in life. So we're not simply looking at the record that they achieved in high school, but also what hurdles they had to overcome.
Jason, how would you answer that question?
Well, I don't think it's a question that just applies to elite schools. I think colleges in general should prioritize admitting those students who have the most to gain out of a four-year college education. And I think we probably funnel too many kids into liberal arts colleges, more kids than probably can get something out of the experience. So we've sort of decided that a four-year college education is the end-all be-all to a successful life. I don't think the data really bear that out. You sort of have the economists call a fallacy of composition there. You know, one person stands up at a stadium, he can see better. If everyone stands up, everyone can't see better. Everyone who gets a college education is not going to get ahead. And yet that's sort of the attitude that we've gone with for many decades. But I do think it should be about finding those kids who have the most to gain from a college education, and then you get down to how do you choose them? Because as you said, it is a zero-sum game, particularly at our elite institutions. And I think the least bad option, or the least bad way of choosing is objective standards, test scores, GPAs, and so forth. And I take those over the way we used to do it, nepotism, connections, and so forth. So while sort of meritocratic approach isn't perfect, I think I'd take it over the other options out there.
Justin, same question?
I think it's worth saying that college admissions officers have tremendous amounts of discretion about who to admit, given that the number of students with 4.0s and 1600s far exceeds the capacity at many of these institutions. I agree with my colleagues here that contemplating who has the most to gain from a college education, an elite college education, is something that admissions officers should bear in mind. It does mean, for me, thinking about where people have started out, because the admission to elite colleges really can jumpstart one's ascent up the American economic ladder. I think I disagree respectfully with the idea that we now have meritocratic admissions and that the bad old days of people with wealth and connections and these sorts of things have gone away. I think we're still very much in that world. It's just a question of how race is going to figure there.
Let me go right back to you, Justin, and ask you, why is it okay to consider race in elite admissions, especially given that the 14th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 would seem to ban consideration of race?
Yeah, the text of the Constitution involving the Equal Protection Clause does not say anything like consideration of race is not permitted or racial classifications are verboten. So I think that there's not enough specificity there to be able to make that claim. I would further say that I have no interest whatsoever in defying the Supreme Court's decision. That decision from 2 years ago says that schools may not use race qua race. That's the sort of magic language there. Cannot use race for the sake of race. But that does not prohibit universities from contemplating racial matters in admissions. The Trump administration has been brandishing a misunderstanding of SFFA to say, for example, if universities decide to get rid of standardized tests with an eye toward increasing racial diversity, that is impermissible under SFFA. That decision says nothing of the kind, so I want to emphasize that universities continue to possess an enormous amount of discretion thinking about race. SFFA was a bad decision, but it was also not the end of the world.
Now I want to ask the two of you, because I know you'll disagree on this question, why is it not okay to consider race in elite admissions?
I think my biggest problem with the consideration of race in college admissions is that it hasn't worked. These policies have been around more than 50 years, and they simply have not produced the outcomes that proponents intended. Maybe you can argue they need more time to work, but 50 years is a long time. Just to put some data behind that, we saw black college completion as a percentage of white college completion in this country peak at around 1970. Today, it's right where it was, around 1970. After 50 years of affirmative action, black college completion rates as a percentage of white college completion rates, so right around where they were in 1970. And it's not just affirmative action in the higher education space, which we're focused on here, where you can present data showing that the gains have not been what proponents said, whether it's home ownership rates or employment, incomes, you name it. These policies just simply haven't worked. And we saw faster black progress prior to the implementation of these policies. I think that affirmative action has been given a lot of credit it does not deserve in terms of creating a black middle class in this country. We saw blacks entering the skilled professions at faster rates in the 40s and the 50s, 60s, prior to the first full decade of affirmative action in 1970. So I think the best case against these policies is their track record.
Yeah, so to my mind, I'll come back to that issue of fairness. If you look at public opinion polling, the vast majority of Americans, 74% in the Pew Research poll, say they don't want race to count in who gets ahead, who gets in. Now, this is a complicated issue. We have a terrible history in this country of racial oppression that we have to address in some fashion, in my view. So that's why I kind of argue for a third way. that is, no to racial preferences, but yes to economic affirmative action, giving extra consideration to students who've overcome economic obstacles, a disproportionate share of whom are Black and Hispanic, precisely because of our history of discrimination in this country. It is no accident that Black and Hispanic people are disproportionately low income, disproportionately having low wealth. And so we ought to consider those factors in my view. But that is the public opinion polling, again, will suggest people understand that. They think that's a fair system. And so they, that's to my mind, the reason to be concerned about the use of race, but also to, I think it's important to honor the arguments in favor of racial preferences, because we do have a history that needs reckoning with. And Dr. King, when he was faced with this issue, said we have to address our history of discrimination, and therefore we need a Bill of Rights for the disadvantaged. It was not a Bill of Rights for Black people, because he saw that would divide the progressive coalition of working Americans. But he did think that economic affirmative action would indirectly address our history without resorting to the use of race that so many Americans consider fundamentally unfair.
Could I jump in for a second? I want to return to this question about what did affirmative action accomplish, and I think it accomplished quite a lot, actually. If you look at the fall of 1960, the college students who entered Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, it was about 3,000 students who entered those elite schools, and a grand total of 15 Black people were among their number. That is about 1/2 of 1%. You flash forward a decade later, and it's just shy of 300, about 10% of the class. That seems to me to be an incredible transformation for where Black people belong in American society. And what starts on the college campuses will then filter into the larger professions. And between 1970 and 1990, you see the numbers of Black lawyers, Black physicians, Black engineers, Black professors, skyrocket. The only other thing I would say about this idea that the sort of golden age for Black people is between 1940 and 1970, Jim Crow reigned supreme for the overwhelming bulk of that time. If those are the good old days, I don't want to go back to them. The idea that, yes, there were some Black economic improvements, but going from broke to slightly less broke is not an occasion for uncorking the champagne, in my view.
Well, golden age and good old days are your terms, not mine. I'm assessing the effects of a policy by using before and after data. It's an empirical argument. Either Black gains were faster back then or they weren't. And I think the data is quite strong that they were. I just want to piggyback on something Rick said about public sentiment. He's absolutely right. The Students for Fair Admissions v. Harvard case was hugely popular among the general public in this country. Something around 70% of Americans supported the outcome of that decision, including an absolute majority of every major racial and ethnic group in this country supported that outcome. So we have to keep in mind there's often a divergence between elite opinion in this country and the opinion of the rank and file American. And this is yet another example of that. There are a lot of elites in the media, my profession, academia, among activists who are outraged over that decision. But most of this country simply shrugged. They do not like racial preferences in the workplace or in academia. And so I think we need to keep that in mind as we discuss it.
I'd like to just make this point, but not spend a lot of time on it, but just as a point to make in riposte to you, Jason. I don't think when college presidents in the era when affirmative action was starting, when they were justifying it, they were saying essentially we want to integrate our campus community and alumni, they weren't saying, if we do this, it'll increase black homeownership rates, 30 years from now.
You're right, and that's because the term's meaning has evolved. When we're back in the late 60s, the term affirmative action means outreach. It means looking for those groups that have been overlooked in the past and helping to bring them up to existing standards, whether in the workforce or on college campuses. That is no longer what affirmative action is today. What it has become is a way to lower certain standards to achieve a certain amount of racial balance on college campuses. And it is that latter definition of affirmative action, as it is used in practice in this country, that I think the public opposes. But that original meaning of affirmative action is something most Americans support, including myself.
So let me show some of my obsession with testing here, if I may. So universities did two things within a fairly compressed time that wasn't part of their long histories. One is affirmative action, and one is adopting quote-unquote meritocracy, standardized test requirements. Those two things are somewhat in collision. The way universities typically and still use the quantitative side of admissions is they create a blended number from the high school GPA and SAT or ACT scores, and they use it to predict primarily first-year grades. So there's an argument for that. You know, it's not crazy. The argument is we want to pick the students who will do best academically at our primarily academic institutions. So here's the question. I'm going to start with you, Rick. If that's valid, and by the way, it does produce a very class-skewed and racially skewed group, but why shouldn't Harvard, Yale, and Princeton be like Stuyvesant High School and just say, you know, to heck with all these preferences, racial, athletic, class, everything, and let's just pick people based on those numbers because those are the ones that will perform the best academically. What's wrong with that?
It's not a measure of true merit.
Wait, I'm not saying it's true. I'm asking you, why should they admit people who are, by their stats, likely to perform less well academically at the expense of someone who, by their stats, is likely to perform better academically? What's the goal of this whole process?
Because they are educated students who will be on campus for 4 years and then go out into the world and make contributions that are important to our society. And so that, to my mind, is why it's relevant, or one of the reasons why it's relevant to look at obstacles overcome. Because Justice Douglas talked about this. The great William O. Douglas was against race-based affirmative action, in favor of economic affirmative action. And he used the phrase, in the long haul of the career of an individual, that the potential is likely to be greater for someone who's, on paper, looks a little less qualified, but managed to accomplish that record, having grown up in a single-parent home, gone to lousy high schools, and somehow, miraculously, got a 1300 on the SAT anyway. That he wants to bank on that individual.
I want to drill down on this a little bit, just to, is it that you're handing out a reward and people of lesser economic backgrounds are just more deserving? Is it that that person you think is going to be an equivalent academic performer over the 4 years? Is it that you think they're going to give back more to society? What are you going to get back from having in every kind of place? Is it that you're going to have a more interesting climate on campus?
That as well. You are going to get a more interesting climate on campus. You are indirectly going to get racial diversity, which I think is important in our society, that we have a leadership class that is racially integrated. I think that's a positive benefit. They will not do as well in the 4 years of college. I'm not going to claim that, because if you take someone who has been given everything in life and then compare them in the 4 years of college with someone who's had to struggle economically, You don't expect to make that up immediately, but there is evidence to suggest that you can greatly expand the socioeconomic diversity on campuses, and students will graduate and succeed. So I was involved in, as an expert witness in suing Harvard and the University of North Carolina. And I said racial diversity is very important, but Harvard and UNC can achieve that without using racial preferences. If they got rid of the legacy preferences and preferences for wealthy people, and also gave a break to economically disadvantaged students. And one of Harvard's arguments was, oh, well, we have to lower our academic standards then. Well, it turned out that you could get almost as much racial diversity and much more economic diversity. And the average SAT would go from the 99th percentile to the 98th. Now, this is a group of students which is much more economically diverse. A lot of people that face hard knocks, and yet they're at the 98th, as a group, are at the 98th percentile. So students, there are a lot of high-performing, low-income students out there who can do the work at these institutions. Statistically, they're much more, wealthy are much more likely to be in that very top SAT scores, set of scores. But these institutions can become much more economically diverse, and the students are not going to be flunking out.
Justin, how do you react to the argument that Rick just made and has made elsewhere, that you can go class-aware, race-blind, without a deleterious effect on the racial integration level of these schools?
Just to clarify, I wouldn't say there's no change. So at Harvard, you would go from 14% black to 10% black, but you'd be much more socioeconomically diverse. But I don't claim that it's the best way to get certain racial results. Of course, is to use racial preferences.
You know, maybe the best evidence for this proposition is what we just saw out of Princeton, New Jersey, which just welcomed the class of 2029 to campus. And they say that they have more students who are receiving Pell Grants and from modest backgrounds than ever before. And they also have fewer black students than they've had since the 1960s. The black enrollment at Princeton plummeted to 5%. So I fear that simply sort of class preferences are going to lead to declining black enrollment. And the truth is, we've seen this movie before. In the 1990s, the University of California and California as a whole got rid of affirmative action, and black enrollment there plummeted in its aftermath. I understand that there's vigorous debates about how those numbers emerged over time. But people have been making this point since the dawn of the affirmative action age, saying, well, if you go simply class, yes, black people are disproportionately poor, but black people are a minority, and there are a lot of poor white people out there. And so if you use simply class, I fear that that's going to lead to a diminution of underrepresented racial minorities on campus.
Princeton is an unfortunate example. I just saw those data, but there are lots of other colleges out there. Yale is not using racial preferences and has 12% black population in the most recently admitted class. So there's tremendous variation. I've always encouraged universities to look at wealth because there's a big, there's already a considerable income gap between people of different racial groups. There's a gigantic wealth gap. And before Jason jumps on me, I'm not doing this just to reverse engineer a certain racial result. Wealth matters to opportunity in America. It's the fair thing to do, to count whether someone comes from a low wealth background. But it will also have a positive racial dividend. So I think it does matter, and I'm glad to talk with the Princeton folks about what they could be doing differently, because some universities are doing well by racial diversity, even with we're presuming that they're following the law and not using racial preferences. And the ones who are less successful, like Princeton, should be learning from those who are more successful.
Jason, do you agree with what Rick said about it's important for society to have a racially diverse leadership class? As I read you and hear you, you're more concerned with the overall progress of Black America. Do you care about that other issue? Or do you think they're connected?
I think how you get there matters. I mean, you can artificially prop up a group and make it seem like they've made more progress than they've actually made, and that's ultimately going to catch up with them, I think. And so I don't think there are any shortcuts to getting there. If we want diversity, again, I'd look at the past. We were making progress on this front, more rapid progress on this front in the pre-affirmative action era. And we're also talking about this from the perspective of whether schools will benefit, rather than whether the students, the intended beneficiaries, will benefit. And I mentioned earlier that these policies haven't worked. It's even worse than that. I think in many cases they've been counterproductive. You've taken very bright students who would be hitting it out of the park at a less selective school, shoehorn them into a more selective school where they're more likely to drop out, switch to easier majors, pool at the bottom of the class, and so forth. I think that's a huge problem. Justin mentioned, first of all, I agree with Justin on the problem of the class diversity, or the class-based affirmative action. First of all, I'm not sure it will pass constitutional muster if this comes back to the Supreme Court. Chief Justice Roberts, in his majority opinion in Students for Fair Admissions, was pretty clear in saying, not only can you not use race, you can't use proxies for race to achieve the same end. And clearly, I mean, Rick is more honest about it. He wants to use class as a proxy for race. But Justin's right. You've got a math problem there. One is there are way more poor white people than black people in America. And among poor whites, they tend to outperform poor blacks academically. Same with poor Asians, tending to outperform poor blacks. So moving to a class-based system, it's going to be very, very hard to replicate the diversity you're getting under affirmative action. So you have some pragmatic issues there. But just to go back to the California experience that you mentioned, because Justin's right, we don't have to wait and see what will happen after Students for Fair Admissions. 9 or 10 states have done this before students. They banned it. California did it. Florida did it. Texas did it. Michigan did it. And so we know what happens. And Justin's right. Some of the elite schools in the University of California system, so we're talking about Berkeley, UCLA, Black and Hispanic enrollment initially drops by quite a bit. There is some recovery, however, later on. But more importantly, and this gets back to, are we more concerned about the schools and how the racial mix on campus, or are we more concerned about giving kids a quality education? More importantly, in the post ban on affirmative action in California, Black student enrollment throughout the University of California system rose. And not by a little bit. So did Black college graduation rates in the University of California system. They rose. So did Black GPAs. They rose. Because kids were being better matched with schools. One of the most important factors in where a kid goes to school and how well that kid will do is how academically they're prepared relative to their peers at the same institutions. And this isn't necessarily a race issue. If you're going to submit student athletes with SAT scores 300 points below those of the average student at a school, you're going to see student athletes pooling at the bottom of the class. You're going to see them dropping out at higher rates. If Harvard decided to admit left-handed redheads with SAT scores 300 points below those of the average Harvard student, you would see left-handed redheads pooling at the bottom of the class. It doesn't matter whether you're the child of a donor, a star athlete, or whomever. The problem is you need to match a kid with a school where their preparation roughly matches those of their peers. That is the recipe for success. And that is what affirmative action works against. And that is why I think it largely has not been successful.
I want to pivot to spend a few minutes, we don't have all that much time before we go to audience questions, to ask you all to talk about what the Trump administration is doing right now. Now, picking up on some of what Jason was saying, it goes back to Roberts, et cetera. There's the idea that, well, I can't quite pull this apart, maybe you guys can. There's definitely the idea that, you know, yes, SFFA happened, but we know you guys are cheating. And that's why we're demanding a tremendous amount of data that we didn't used to have. And then as I read the directives from the federal government to the universities, they're saying, we believe these class-based systems of the kind that Rick's so strongly associated with are simply disingenuous. They're camouflage to allow you to do what you really want to do, which is racial preferences. So I'd like to get all of you to give a read on how you size all this up.
First of all, I think Trump is absolutely right to ask for data on the race and SAT scores because there is a suspicion that universities could be cheating, and they receive tremendous amounts of public funds. We want to make sure they're following the law. I have no problem with accountability and transparency. Where I have a huge problem is where Trump is making this allegation that class-based affirmative action is proxy discrimination. Now, the whole point of the research I've been engaged in is that we've been using race as a poor proxy for disadvantage. And that's why it's unpopular. When Barack Obama was asked if his kids deserved a preference, he had to answer no, because people got that his kids were quite privileged, and using race was a poor proxy for what really mattered. And so now there's this, the Trump administration is pursuing a legal argument. I'll disagree with Jason on this one. I think there's almost no chance that the Supreme Court strikes down class-based affirmative action. They've already had two cases that came up before them, one involving Thomas Jefferson High School, a selective school in Virginia, another involving the Boston exam schools, where they are using class-based affirmative action. And in the Thomas Jefferson case, there were only two justices, Alito and Thomas, on the far right, who were upset about the class-based affirmative action approach. So I don't see that happening. I just want to make one other quick point on the issue, Jason, that you've been raising over time. That there was greater black success, in greater gains in the 40s, 50s, 60s than since then. It sounds, and you had a wonderful rejoinder to that, Justin, in terms of colleges. But at the same time, you're right that the progress was greater, and Robert Putnam has written about this. And so, what's going on? We had racial apartheid in the country. Why was there black progress? And my answer will not surprise those of you who've been hearing me talk about class. Labor unions were strong in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and there were some labor unions that were discriminatory, but as a whole, black people were part of an economy where economic equality was prized, and so that's the larger point here is that those who are economically disadvantaged will benefit when there are measures in place, economic measures in place to support disadvantaged people.
Justin, do you want to add to this?
Yeah, a few things. One is we have seen over the last couple of years a significant decline in black students on the nation's finest campuses. MIT went from 15% black to 5% black. Amherst went down to 3% black. Incredible shortfalls have happened at Columbia, Brown, Cornell, Johns Hopkins. The list goes on and on. We are in the midst of seeing, or perhaps more actively not seeing, a lost generation of black students, and that's going to have cascading consequences for American society. So that's point one. Point two, about the Trump administration and its efforts to sort of use SFFA as a cudgel to intimidate universities. They have extracted agreements to get data from Brown and Columbia and they are attempting to lower the already depressed number of black students on those campuses. I think that this nation is confronting profound problems right now. Too many black students on fancy college campuses is not among their number. Chief Justice Roberts, and this is my last point, Chief Justice Roberts in SFFA versus Harvard says eliminating racial discrimination means eliminating all of it. Given the Supreme Court decision that was handed down yesterday, authorizing police officers to grab people and arrest them on suspicion of being an unauthorized immigrant, and race is one of the criteria, it's very hard to take that seriously. I think it's very important that we zoom out and appreciate President Trump's ambitions on this front. The administration is run by a neo-nativist mindset that views black and brown people as suspect. And so I am deeply alarmed by what's happening in the nation today, and it's very hard to take conservatives seriously when they say we're invested in colorblindness, given the horrors that are happening in our nation right now.
I think we're at the moment of going to audience questions, if I'm watching the clock correctly. So there's bright lights shining in my eyes, and I can't see your hand up unless you're in the first few rows. So I'm gonna need some help from library staff here, but ma'am, you go first.
Okay. Hi, I'm a journalist. My name is D.T. Myers, and we run Black Voter magazine as well as a bunch of other stuff. And it's really confusing what you guys are saying because you're not being monoracial. You can't love Black America with Africans or with Haitians or Caribbeans and Latinos. It just doesn't work, right? So explain that to me. When you say you're concerned, are you concerned considering that Black Americans are not immigrants? Are you putting them with immigrants? I need to understand that part.
Who wants to take that one on?
I think that affirmative action has been used to bring in black and brown students to college campuses, and I applaud those efforts. I take your point that there are different experiences that different racial groups have, but that's not necessarily a problem. Well, I would say one of the things I do in my book is to try to promote a way going forward that is constitutionally permissible in the aftermath of SFFA versus Harvard, and I have different plans for examples. You could have, colleges could have preferences for members of Native American tribes. Colleges could have preferences for, I'm sorry, do you mind if I just finish? Why don't we take another question?
Okay,
Thanks, Matthew Levy. I've written about this question and benefited from Nick's advice in numerous ways. One of the arguments that always struck me as disingenuous from elite schools was, well, we educate such a tiny sliver of America. We really ought to focus on the non-flagship campuses at the state universities or HBCUs or other community colleges or other places that can do far more work to uplift than we at Harvard or Princeton or Yale. And I always felt it was a little bit disingenuous. It was kind of ducking the question. Some of you probably aware Andy Smarrick at the Manhattan Institute has been working on this idea that there's actually far greater influence coming out of our state universities, our secondary campuses of our state universities in terms of judges and city council members and so on. And I just wonder if that's, is that argument cogent, important, appealing to any of you?
say again exactly what the question is that you're asking.
So there's been an argument that the whole focus on whether economic or racial diversity at elite schools is something that really ought to be pushed to the secondary campuses, because the Harvards, for instance, and Yales are never going to educate more than a tiny sliver. Andy Smarik at the Manhattan Institute is making the argument that in terms of leadership influence in America, that you've got to look at these broader metrics of the secondary state campuses, college, that those places are graduating more future judges and city council members and elected representatives that represent the elite or the leadership that.
Yeah, I think if I understand you correctly, I think I would agree with that. This focus on we've got to get these underprivileged minority kids into these top 30 or 40 elite schools in the country, like a Yale or jail mentality almost, is not something I would accept. Now, one of the arguments people use is that they say, well, let's say you admit the black kid or the Hispanic kid with slightly lower test scores or grade point in high school grades, they're going to be going to a better school, so they'll get a better education. But there have been studies out there that call that into question. Previous questioner mentioned HBCUs. There's a study done of black law school graduates at Howard University in DC, which does not use affirmative action. No HBCUs use affirmative action. And law graduates, black law graduates at George Mason University, which is a more selective law school. Turns out that the Howard graduates passed the bar on first try at significantly higher rates than the black law students who've been admitted to George Mason University under affirmative action. So now the question now is, did those black students who were admitted with lower standards, in fact, get a better education at the higher ranked school than they would have gotten at a school that was moving at a pace where they could keep up and thrive? And so I agree that this obsession with getting these students into these selective colleges, I think we're overdoing it, particularly if we care most about not just what the freshman class looks like, but who actually graduates at the end of the day. What is the point of flunking out of MIT instead of graduating from I don't know, Northeastern or something? Flunking out of the University of Michigan instead of graduating from Michigan State. I mean, what are we trying to do here?
I agree and disagree with the point. So Tony and I actually did some work together on community colleges, and because you're absolutely right in terms of the numbers, that's where you can have a big impact on making sure that those who are currently being left behind have a better chance. At the same time, there is research to suggest about half of government leaders and half of corporate leaders come from just 12 very wealthy, selective institutions. So I think we can hold both those things in our head at once. That we have to do a lot to improve colleges across the board, but that it still matters who goes to these selective institutions.
Okay, you guys want to pick, because I can only see the first few rows, and I don't want to be too skewed.
So I think this is a question for Jason. I think there's been this refrain of affirmative action doesn't work, and that's sort of a knock against it. And I think from some of your colleagues, at some point, there was a mention of maybe part of the point of affirmative action is to create a black elite, not so much to raise the black middle class, in as much of the schools that practice affirmative action only educate this very small sliver of society. I think when that came up earlier, and forgive me if I'm misrepresenting you, you said roughly, well, it matters how you get there, and this isn't the right way to get there, and that's not a valid purpose for affirmative action. When you say affirmative action doesn't work, is there a preferred metric that you have? Is there sort of a statistic where if this statistic was met, that you would agree that affirmative action had worked? Because if one of the goals is to create a black elite, and it has arguably done that, why does that not count? Why is that not an effective?
Well, like I said earlier, it has not created this black elite. You know who created the black elite? The HBCUs. That's who educated black people primarily in the 40s and 50s and 60s when white schools would not let them in. That is who's created the black middle class in this country. And they did not use affirmative action to do it. And my point again going back to the California example that I mentioned earlier, after California ended affirmative action, black college graduation rates went up, and not by a little bit. So a policy that had been put in place to increase the ranks of the black middle class, increase the number of black entering skilled professions, had in practice resulted in fewer black doctors and lawyers and architects than we would have had in the absence of the policy. That's what the track record shows. So again, I go back to people thinking, giving affirmative action far more credit than I think the track record shows it deserves.
I just have to jump in here. I'm not sure that that claim holds. There's a part of your argument where you're talking about the black race writ large, and things were moving in the right direction between 1940 and 1970 and at a faster rate. But just because things slow down for the entire black race after 1970 doesn't mean that it's affirmative action that is to blame for that. Just because something happens after something else happens, that's just a very difficult. There are other phenomena that one might want to explore. You know, the decline of industry and these other positions that were the foundation of the black middle class in 1940 and 1970. And what I'm concerned about is a slightly different thing, which is black people making their way into the elite boardrooms and universities and changing the conception of where black people belong in American society. So it's a very different thing that we're talking about here.
Okay, ma'am, Rick.
I know we're talking a lot about affirmative action in terms of admission, but I'm curious how some of you think about a broader definition of affirmative action in terms of the experience that students have once they're on campus, which you touched on, and then also cost. So, you know, it could be that the admissions are the issue. It could be that people of color are making different choices because of cost, because of how they have heard they will feel when they're on that campus in their classes. Their feeling of belonging or being seen for themselves, for, you know, being included. So where does choice factor in where people are deciding to even apply, and then where does cost? I mean, Pell Grants are one thing, but the costs are astronomical, particularly at the elite college. Yeah. Factors.
Well, I think there's a misperception about the elite colleges and, you know, their sticker prices versus what's provided. And there's years ago, William Bowen did some research to suggest that you know, it was actually much less expensive to go to a lot of these elite colleges because of the generous financial aid that was provided. I will say that you know, one of the arguments used against class-based affirmative action was that this is just going to cost too much money, and it will require more financial aid. That was one of the arguments that the University of North Carolina used in the litigation. They said, well, yes, it's true that class-based affirmative action can get you racial diversity, but we just don't have the financial resources. Within 2 weeks of the Supreme Court decision striking down the use of race, the University of North Carolina announced a brand new, much more generous financial aid package. So these institutions need to make some tough choices in order to make financial aid available, but it can be done and has been done at a number of these institutions.
Do you guys want to designate another question or beyond what I can say?
One more. Over here. My mic.
I'm Matt Barnum. I'm a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Thanks for this panel. I was wondering if the panel could speak about the idea of affirmative action for descendants of American slaves. I know Justin has written about that, so I'm curious his take. But I'm also interested in those who oppose race-based affirmative action, if they would be open to affirmative action for descendants of American slaves.
Okay.
Let me set up the question for my panelists. So this is an argument that I advance in my book as something that is constitutionally permissible after the SFFA decision, which again says what's forbidden is race qua race. Race for race's sake is what Chief Justice Roberts says. Counterintuitively, originalism opens the door to preferences for the descendants of the enslaved. Because one of the difficulties for originalists is what to do with the Freedmen's Bureau, a contemporaneous governmental action that was designed to help Black people. That's how it's traditionally understood. Justice Thomas, in his separate writing in SFFA, says, no. The Freedmen's Bureau was not about helping Black people. That was about the status of having been enslaved. That's different than race. Whereupon this issue also arose in oral argument, and Justice Kavanaugh jumped in and said, but that means that preferences for the descendants of the enslaved is not race qua race in effect. And of course, in the modern day, there are plenty of people who would fall into the descendants of slave category, but there are plenty of Black people, relatively recent immigrants to the country, who would not fall into that category. And that means that we should not regard it as race qua race. There are Black people in both categories, and so it cannot be dismissed as an impermissible racial preference.
Anybody else? Well, we're getting to the end, right?
That was our final question.
Okay,
So do you have any final
have
thoughts?
the last
Can I
word.
comment on that? I've read your book. I recommend it to folks to it makes you think on a number of issues. This is one where I disagree. The Freedmen's Bureau was established for those who had been enslaved at that moment. There were no Black millionaires in that group. That's what drives people nuts about race-based, what drove them nuts about race-based preferences, and the same would apply to those who are descendants of those who were enslaved. That you're talking about individuals who may have had all sorts of advantages in life, receiving a preference. Reparations, this is a form of reparations, poll at around 19% support. So I can agree with you, Justin, that one can make a clever legal argument that this isn't race per se, and therefore you can use Justice Thomas's argument against him. But in the court of public opinion, this would be disastrous. And that ought to matter to universities. I mean, if there's any lesson to the way that universities have been pummeled in recent months by the Trump administration, it's that if you are an institution that relies on public funds, you can't just thumb your nose at public opinion. It should matter what the general public thinks about different issues. And so that's why I worry about a preference for those who can trace ancestry to those who've been enslaved.
Yeah, one word, Jason, and then
Sure, I think I would probably agree with Rick on this, and for the reasons he stated regarding public opinion, we're an increasingly diverse society, we're an increasingly pluralistic society. To me, it just does not make sense to create or expand a racial spoil system in America that has the government picking winners and losers based on racial and ethnic background. I think that is a recipe for division, even more division than we have today. And anyone that wants to see us move forward together can't be in favor of the government playing that type of role. And so on those grounds, I think I would oppose the system that Justin laid out.
Okay, so this is, we have to stop, but thank you all. It was a terrific time.